It is not always the case that one has to be given the opportunity to talk about what is good from Africa. Usually, and I'm going to start with one common question that I am asked. So do you speak Swahili? I come from Africa. And the fact is, the first time I met someone who spoke Swahili was in the United States. Because East and West Africa are so far away that the first time I met someone who spoke Swahili was when I was a graduate student at the University of Illinois. And it makes me realize how much gap there is in terms of understanding the diversity of Africa. And so I am very honored today to be given the opportunity to chair this panel about what is good from Africa. This session brings together three distinguished scholars addressing various aspects of African cultures, their societies, historical, political, and economic forces, and the crises that are engendered by different factors, as we have heard today, either from internal or external forces, but also to allow us to see at this 21st century, the Google generation, the rappers of Dakar who have transformed the rural youngsters, farmers, into urban youngsters and into participants and experts on Snoop Dogg and other. It's always interesting when I go home and they ask me, so, big brother, you came from Africa. Tell us about Snoop Dogg. You know, I don't know anything about Snoop Dogg. But this panel, I hope, will, the fictional and often romanticized depiction of wild Africa, with its gangrenous pandemic diseases and wars, in traditional travel narratives, tourist accounts, and pictures that seem to capture the exotic and the worst of Africa, have engendered in the psyche of Western global media consumers an illusory continent in which facts are often fictionalized and fiction is factualized. The fictionalization of Africa and the African issues in the media and the popular literature that tend to blend facts and fiction has rendered perceptions of Africa, its cultures, societies, customs, and conflict often superficial in the popular consciousness. So while Africa continues to fascinate both scholars and students in the West for its largely misunderstood crises and challenges, work that specifically seeks to separate facts from fiction and uncover the immense diversity, the resilience, and ingenuity of Africa and its people remain rare commodities in the current literature and the global media. So I am very pleased today to introduce three distinguished scholars whose work will bring fresh and much-needed insights for a more factual understanding of the complexities of the continent against its superficial stereotypical representations. Our first speaker, Professor Bahru Zewde, did I pronounce it well? Okay. Is Emeritus Professor of History at Addis Ababa University and Executive Director of the Forum for Social Studies. So I'm not going to go through all the bios that I have received here, but I do want to give you a flavor of the array of expertise that each of the members of the panel bring today here. And the second speaker will be Dr. Mark Summers. And Dr. Mark Summers is a Jennings Randolph Senior Fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace. He is also a research fellow with Boston University's African Studies Center and an associate research fellow of humanitarian studies in the Institute of Human Security at the Fletcher Schools at Tufts University. And our third speaker is Dr. Heran Sereke-Brhan. Did I get it right? Heran is joining the Pardee Center after a hiatus in Ethiopia, where she worked on a range of academic and cultural projects. She received her BA at Miles College in Oakland, California, then went on to graduate schools in African history at Michigan State University, studying with Harold Marcus, that I'm sure many of you know. So what I hope to do is probably let each of the panelists speak for 50 minutes just to follow the ritual. We have already established a ritual here. And after that, give the floor to the audience for questions and maybe wrap up. And of course, be the gendarme in the back with my 5 minutes card or 2 minutes card. Please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Professor Bahru Zewdi.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I will try to deliver on the promise of the grassroots, but I'm afraid my intellectual inclinations would drag me back to the heights of intellectualdom. So I will say something about mass culture and then go to the think tanks and research organizations that I would like to highlight for this particular conference. If I could go to the next one. Of course, as you know, I mean, it's very, very challenging to be Afro-optimist, but it's a very good exercise as long as we bear in mind that there are also challenges. So I would like to dwell on first question of sports in Africa. The films part, I think I would leave to Heran in the interest of time, and also because I feel that she would probably handle it much more competently than I would. And then focus much more on what I call the think tanks and research networks that have developed in Africa in the last few years or decades, actually, some of them. And finally, say a few words about a newly emerging foundation, an African foundation, and then conclude with some thoughts. I mean, speaking on the eve of the Boston Marathon, it would be really a miss on my part if I don't say something about African sports, particularly athletics. The virtual dominance in long-distance running that Africa has enjoyed over the years. As a matter of fact, nowadays, the question is not who is winning, but which country is winning. Which of the two countries, Ethiopia or Kenya? In fact, we have already started with the Paris Marathon, and the Boston Marathon is also going to be probably a contest between the two countries. So this is really one of the things that is probably going to continue. And this has been achieved against all odds in some countries, in terms of institutions, in terms of bureaucracies that athletes have to struggle against in some of the countries. And yet, in spite of these phenomenal achievements in athletics, the heart of Africa, the heartbeat of Africa is with football, with what you call soccer in this part of the world. And in that sense, of course, 2010 is the year of Africa. The year of Africa, not only because it is the 50th anniversary of the independence, but also because the World Cup is being held in Africa, on African soil for the first time. But even the controversies, the debates, and so on that surround the South Africa World Cup preparations really highlights the ambivalence with which the world views Africa. The lingering doubts that the world has about the capability of Africa to stage this kind of performance. If you remember, a few months back, we had the African Cup of Nations, and there was this incident at Cabinda, and all the pundits and gurus in Europe were saying, "We told you so. Africa is not ready." And yet, of course, as the president of the local organizing committee in South Africa said, Cabinda is farther away from Cape Town than Kosovo was from Paris in 1998, and nobody thought about canceling the World Cup. In 1972, the Munich Olympics, if you remember, how many athletes, Israeli athletes, were killed by Palestinian guerrillas, and the game went on without any interruption. So when it comes to Africa, there are always question marks. So I think this is also something that probably makes any good news that one brings from Africa such a challenging exercise. And of course, recently this killing of Sereke-Brhan again has raised this question. But in spite of that, of course, this is. And what this highlights is, of course, the growing prominence of African stars in the world of football, beginning from Salif Keita. I don't know how many of you know Salif Keita. He's really the pioneer of African football, professional African football, the first to go to Europe and play in France and later on in Spain, to Didier Drogba, George Weah, of course, probably the only world footballer of the year, African world footballer of the year. And of course, this has been, yet there's the minus side. The negative side is that this has been achieved at a price. The cost for the domestic league, the siphoning of so much talent, sometimes under dubious contractual arrangements, with the exception of Egypt. Egypt is the only country that was able to win the African Cup in 3 successive tournaments. And what is the secret? The secret has got to do with the fact that most of the Egyptian players are actually homegrown. They play in the domestic league. And also there is a problem, the fact that the domestic leagues in almost all countries have really suffered. African football fans are riveted on the Premier League or the Spanish La Liga rather than on the domestic leagues. And this, of course, is incurring considerable cost for Africa. Next one I will skip and then focus on really the major point that I would like to focus upon for you. And these are the think tanks and some of the research networks that have grown in Ethiopia. And these, I think, have played an important role and continue to play a very important role in knowledge production, capacity building, and the emergence of a distinctive African voice on issues of development, of governance, and so on. University of Pennsylvania survey, there's a program on civil society in 2009, so that Africa still has a long way to go in terms of really fostering think tanks and so on, but about 8% or 424 think tanks were identified, and of these, 2 major think tanks or research networks were CODESRIA and the Center for Conflict Resolution based in Cape Town, which were nominated as 2, rather, of the influential 407 think tanks all over the world. So I would like to focus on these 4 institutions with which I have been very familiar. CODESRIA, not only through my membership and my involvement in some of the research networks that it organized, and also currently editing one of the journals, Africa Review of Books. Austria, because I was also involved there for quite some time as vice president for something like 6 years. The Center for Conflict Resolution, which I have come to know very recently, but I have not been really that much directly involved. And the Forum for Social Studies, which I helped to found in 1998, and in which I served as board director and until I became executive director in 2005. I'm just actually finishing my tenure there. So CODESRIA, I think this is an organization that most of you are probably familiar with, arose in a way from the crisis of African universities in the 1970s. I think we're already talking about the 1970 being the low point. There was a very graphic presentation earlier in the afternoon. That was a low point in many ways, and also I think higher education was seriously affected because of the shortage of funds and also because of the flight abroad of quite a number of members of staff and personnel. So this was a time when African intellectuals had to think about an alternative mechanism, an alternative institutional setup to help stem the tide of decline. I think, as you know, probably Makerere typified this decline It was at one time considered the jewel of higher education in Eastern Africa, but under Amin, it really went down to the depths of decay. So CODESRA was set up to address some of these very crucial issues, and it was able to achieve quite a number of things, emerging as an authentic African voice on major issues of development, including, of course, the journal African Development, fostering a tradition of democratic governance and debates through the General Assembly and the duly elected Executive Committee, and fostering a multidisciplinary and comparative research through different networks at the national as well as regional or sub-regional level. And the dissemination of knowledge, research products through books, journals. In fact, currently, CODESRA is sponsoring something like 10 journals in different disciplines, sociology, history, and also since 2004, the South Africa Review of Books, which is modeled after some of the major journals, book review journals. And also training through summer institutes, targeting particularly the youth, gender, on issues of gender and governance. Austria is, next slide, is not as much known, and yet it has been doing in its own modest fashion quite something similar to what CODESRA has been doing continentally on a Pan-African level. It has been there since 1980, actually, not 1981, there is a mistake there. And it has 23 chapters, actually, something that's different from CODESRA. It has a chapter system of organization with 23 chapters, in other words, countries represented. It is a sub-regional, including not only Eastern Africa, but also Southern Africa. Initially, it started with Eastern Africa. That's why the acronym has stuck. The Austria, there is no S. But since 1995 or something, actually it has included also countries within Southern Africa, including South Africa, Namibia, Lesotho, and all the others. And it has been supporting, like Austria, CODESRA rather, social science research, and also sometimes focusing on specific areas like gender research, and training in research methodology and so on. Then the Center for Conflict Resolution is another very important organization with which you might be very familiar, some of you at least. It was only African institutions that was nominated among the top 50 non-US top think tanks globally in the University of Pennsylvania survey that I mentioned earlier. I will really have to rush because I'm running out of time. It started initially in 1968 with a very restricted domestic focus, interracial dialogue, but of course international studies, but has emerged as a Pan-African vision, as a Pan-African organization with the appointment of a Nigerian executive director in, I think, 2003, and come up with a number of major publications on Africa and the UN, on post-apartheid Africa, South Africa, on AU and its institutions, Africa and China, which of course has been a very something that has preoccupied this conference and will continue to preoccupy most of us, I'm sure, for quite some time to come, and the Truth and Reconciliation Council. The final think tank I would like to speak about is the Forum for Social Studies, for which I'm not going to have much time, but about which I know a lot more than the others, which started in 1998. This is a strictly Ethiopian-focused organization doing policy research and dialogue, public dialogue on policy issues, focusing on areas like poverty, environment, and more recently on education, culture, and development. It is an organization that might not be known very well, very broadly in the continent, but has really begun to have a very special place in the national audience, among the national audience. In 2009, one of the popular papers actually rated it as one of the 12 25 most influential organizations or personalities for the year, for that particular year. The final organization that I just want to mention is not exactly a think tank, it's more like a foundation which called Trust Africa, which is based in Dakar, which began as a special initiative for Africa within the Ford Foundation, but has eventually grown into its independent organization and with three major program focus areas: democracy, strengthening democracy in civil society, promoting equitable development, particularly by encouraging African enterprise, and also developing the culture of African philanthropy. So it has particularly had been very successful in Liberia, in post-conflict Liberia, in strengthening civil society organizations. It has one particular program that has achieved considerable success. To conclude then, since I don't have much time, I think these are developments worth celebrating. There's no question, because they have really filled a major gap in knowledge production and training, capacity building, and so on. But of course, there are limitations, and these are things that we have also to ponder. The first and major one is dependency on external funding. Most of these organizations, the think tanks and research networks and so on, rely almost exclusively on external funding from foreign organizations. There have been some attempts to be independent, but still it's at the beginning stage. In some of them, particularly the national organizations like the Forum for Social Studies, suffer from constraining or constrictive political environment. There is a kind of wave of anti-civil society legislation throughout Africa, Uganda, Egypt, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, and so on. These are major challenges that really face them. For future continuity, I think there are two major pillars. The private sector has to be strengthened. There has to be an enabling environment for the private sector. We need to have more Ibrahims, not only as successful business tycoons, but as people who can make a difference in governance as well. And civil society, which of course is the pillar for the successful conduct of the activities of these organizations. Thank you very much.
Our second speaker is Dr. Mark Summers.
Okay. You know, Falou said he was going to be the gendarme for this session, and he's not kidding. He has a 2 here and then a 0. Just so I'm warned. Okay. I was sort of asked when I came this morning. I said, could you print out my notes that I wrote on the plane last night for this presentation? And I'm not sure who it was, and they said, you don't have a PowerPoint? And I thought, well, I got some photographs from my recent trip from Sierra Leone, because most of my PowerPoints seem like a literacy class for me. So I have 2 or 3 slides, and then you can just, switch it every now and then. When I start to get really boring, you should move to another slide. So what I want to do first is to use, was thinking about this last night, is I've done research in 15 countries in Africa, most of them either war or post-war countries. But one thing that looking forward about Africa is that there's this very strong tendency for people to see lots of young African men in cities and to be terrified. And there are these correlations between large numbers of young black men in countries, or youth in countries, and war. And that's really the dominant kind of perspective that security people have with reference to something called the youth bulge. But wait a minute, with Africa, just about every war is over. And in every single one of those countries, those are youth bulge countries. So what we don't know, looking forward, is what's the role of youth in building peace? Because we know it's going on. If it's true, and I don't know if it's true, Statistics in Liberia, I don't know about any of them, but if we can assume that the youth unemployment rate is really 88%, by golly, that's the most peaceful country in the world, as far as I can tell. If anything got anywhere close to that in Boston, this place would be on fire. There's a perspective that's missing in sort of the way I think the international community tends to look at Africa, which is distorted. I'm also going to be drawing from a couple of things from these two books that I'm wrestling with right now. One is almost done. Its new title is Stuck, Rwandan Youth on the Road to Adulthood, and they are definitely stuck on that road, believe me. And the other one is Marley's War, Terror and Transformation in Sierra Leone. And Marley is Bob Marley, and it's always pronounced in Sierra Leone as Bob Marley. It's all one word. What I'm looking there at is the role of youth during and after, the experience of youth during and after the war in Sierra Leone, and the through link, the narrative thread, is the extraordinary influence of popular culture during the war, used by military groups on all sides. And then how these same popular culture, musicians primarily, that were used so prominently in the war are still relied on, particularly Bob Marley, for guidance and encouragement in the post-war era, particularly marginalized male youth. So Adil asked me to come and speak about youth, and I responded. I thanked him, and then I responded by asking him, could you be a little more specific, 50 years from now? And he gave me 3 questions. And the questions are, yes, what sorts of issues will arise? What kinds of, see, it's getting like a literacy class, so I'll move on here. And the solutions might be needed. What I'm going to do is answer these with reference to the situation, views, priorities, and directions of African youth, particularly members of the marginalized youth majority, which is about 90% of all youth in every country in Africa. I mean, one thing about inclusion or exclusion, education systems are pyramids in the developing world, and certainly all over Africa. Most youth in Africa, secondary school age youth, are not supposed to be there. The unit cost is very high. They're not supposed to go to secondary school. I thought that when Bob Rotberg mentioned Zimbabwe, that was an extraordinarily exciting experiment for in a number of different ways, but one of them was in getting so many kids into secondary school. But generally speaking, that doesn't happen. And programs, countries really aren't designed to do that. And the focus right now is to get kids into primary school, not secondary school, and certainly not universities. There's no room, and it's not going to happen. As a matter of fact, and there's a lot of people talk about programming. To me, the one thing that's very important to understand about youth is there's no way that most youth in Africa will ever get into a program because there's too many of them. The challenges have to do with policies, not programs in general. So I'm going to go to the issues, and I'm going to mention 5 very quickly with regards to, as we sort of look at the present and what's in the future. There seem to be 5 important issues. The first one is very important, and that's demographics. We are living in the age of youth. This is the youngest population of human beings in the history of human beings. And the youngest continent in terms of humans is in Africa. Now, the other one is, the other region that's very young is the Middle East. But the Middle East, the anticipation by demographers is that that's going to start to tail off. Not Africa. Africa is going to stay very young for at least another 30 years or so. So it's not only going to be, it's not only the youngest now, it's going to, stand out even more as a very young population. So 86% of today's youth live in the developing world, and 1/4 of the population is between the ages, in the world, is between the ages of 15 and 24. So we're looking at, it's a very hard thing, I think, for people to think about in some place like the United States, which is getting older, because in Africa, it's completely the reverse. The second point has to do with social separation or alienation and movement. And these are related because youth are in the overwhelming majority of urban dwellers, yet most of them act like an outcast minority. And so what you have in cities in particular is a dense concentration of young people, and most of them act as if they don't belong. And so what's going on right now, and it's really seen in cities, is you see young people sort of creating their own culture, their own world, their own society. Most youth leaders do not represent these people. The class separation I have found between youth elites and the 90–95% of the undereducated majority is profound. The distrust and suspicion from undereducated youth is quite strong for leaders. And of course, for female youth, it's even more serious because they're not well represented in youth groups. And I should point out, they're not well represented in most women's groups either. They're too young. And this is, I guess I would say from my experience, the most at-risk group in Africa are adolescent girls and girls in their early 20s, particularly in cities. So the third point I want to mention is adulthood challenges, and this is something that's come out increasingly, is that, for research for both of the books I mentioned, but beyond that, that most youth aren't able to marry. You need land. You're not getting it in a lot of countries. There are lots of youth that are not going to be able to access the land that's required male youth, in order to prepare to marry. Femininity, womanhood, is dependent in a lot of traditional African societies on having somebody to marry. You have to get married and have a child. What if there's nobody to marry? Well, that's the situation for most Sierra Leoneans. That's the situation for most Rwandans, and on and on and on. In fact, in West Africa, there's not only a term, but a song by Steady Bongo in Sierra Leone called the youth man. And a youth man is a male youth who's getting older chronologically, but he can't become a man. So this is quite a significant situation, and I have 5 minutes. Okay, you can now start doing that's more interesting. So I mentioned the female youth issue and the significant class separation. 2 more points from the policy perspective is we have youth-dominated societies, but government and international agencies in general have policies that aren't youth-centered. Youth don't live in sectors, and their priorities can be profoundly different than the priorities that are being identified by governments and international agencies. There's a tendency in many countries for governments and their donor supporters to prioritize agricultural development and private sector investment. What are youth doing? What is 40–50% of the population doing? They're going to cities. They're not in areas for agriculture, and they're in the informal economic sector, and that's where the growth is, the economic growth, not in the private sector in most countries. So the second point is, what kinds of societies are likely to be shaped by these issues? Well, I think the societies where generations are much less interdependent is what's going on with this inability of youth to become adults, so many of them. And there seems to be a broad trend towards youth going their own way. And I think because they can't become adults, because initiation ceremonies are declining in most places, there really isn't much of a choice on this. And also there's this issue of urbanization. You have youth who go to cities and reinvent themselves in many ways. And the frame of reference they have is very different from the rural-based traditions that they grew up with. So even a lot of youth who remain in rural areas, their focus is very much on urban youth culture. And not just in the country, but in the region, in the world. Snoop Dogg and everybody else, you can really, you can see posters of Snoop Dogg and so forth all over the place, in rural Africa as well. So it is a fairly separate and interesting world. And what I find is that if you think about youth leaders, I think we have to have big questions about who do these traditional youth leaders represent. Most of them, for example, in a really extensive survey of youth leaders in Rwanda, were unemployed university graduates. And, you know, mostly guys, very nice guys. But their level of, their ability to do much was very low. So who are youth leaders? Well, in that country, and certainly in Sierra Leone and many others, the singers, the hip-hoppers, are certainly leaders, very influential people with youth, not only in urban areas, but in rural areas. So looking ahead, I haven't gotten the 0 yet. I'm on the 2, so I better hurry up. So what kind of solutions might be needed? I'm going to suggest 2, and I want to emphasize that I think it's absolutely crucial that people start becoming proactive about thinking about what's going on and not to wait. And I think we have to have this concept that once a youth goes to the city, there's no evidence that they're going to leave. Very few ever leave. And so what we see with this super young, unprecedentedly young population, which is Africa today, is that they're ahead of us. They're leading the way, and in a way that they're very separated from the mainstream. And when I say mainstream, I'm actually talking about something that's very small in terms of the proportion of the population, because mainstream society, civil society, quite often doesn't represent them. So what can we do? It seems to me that one role that international actors can make, and that doesn't mean people, you know, from the United States, but people that aren't from that country, it seems to me, can start to facilitate discussions about, because this seems to be, adults are very aware of this issue. You know, youth can't become adults. I've got the 0. I better hurry up. Youth can't become adults. What do we do about this? And I think that there needs to be some discussion about you know, these requirements that actually, in a place like Rwanda, are going to create, an enormous population of people who are growing up and being seen socially as failures. Nobody wants this, but I think there needs to be a discussion about it. The last point I'm going to make, Mr. Gendarme, is that the research that I did for the World Bank, which is the basis of the book for Rwanda, was very radical, particularly for a place like Rwanda, which is, what do? You ask about the views and priorities of the youth majority, that is those who are poor and undereducated, haven't left primary school, who live in rural and urban areas, and then use that information to make policy recommendations. Now, this is radical. Why? Because they're stupid. You don't ask dumb people what they think. You tell them what to do. In Rwanda and Burundi, they have a phrase, you know, we inform the population, the banyagihugu. But what was so interesting is that the findings were so interesting to Rwandan leaders that it really promoted some very interesting discussions. And I think there was a realization that this is really a useful exercise. And the research model that we developed really yielded for Rwanda and Burundi, and I think it can be applied many other places, some really surprising and helpful results. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you for being very cooperative. Our next speaker is Dr. Heron.
Thank you, everyone, for staying awake. I have the dubious honor of being the last speaker of a long day. My topic is currents and happenings in African film and music. It started out being culture, and culture is huge, so I'm going to try and remain focused on film and music. We've talked at length today about some of the portrayals of Africa, real, imagined, or perceived, the enormous sort of political, social, and political problems and economic problems that are projected about Africa. And in some of these media stories, here and there, once in a while, you see, stories of resilience and of sort of the spirit of a community, the strength that ordinary people show in the face of adversities. And whether or not we agree with either of these portrayals, we might be struck by really how, as poet Nikki Giovanni would say, communities raise a song and respond with humor or with satire, and a lot of times with creativity, to political and economic pressures that they're faced with. In creating a context by which to understand African cultural production, literary critic F. Abiola Airele suggests that cultural expression assumes proper significance when considered in light of these political crises and economic deprivation that prevail in most of the continent. In their enormity, these conditions have evoked a paradox of very notable resurgence of creativity in post-independence Africa. Cultural expression in film, in music, in literature, in performance and visual arts continues to be a very important way by which communities wrest meaning out of confrontation with these conditions. I'll begin a little bit with the emergence of African cinema, and I do this as background to the phenomenal expansion of video film in Nigeria, Nollywood. The use of film as a means of expression and communication is a very recent phenomenon in Africa. It marks an instance of major innovation in the use of complex technology as a medium for the expressive culture of the continent. And it arose, African cinema arose partly in reaction to the reductive depictions in early colonial documentaries and the very simplistic and sort of detrimental representation of Africa and Africans in Western commercial cinema. And in response to that, African filmmakers, very gifted and committed African filmmakers, entered the field with the intention of using film pretty much in a didactic way to narrate African lives and project African realities from a distinct and very sharply contrasting perspective. And I think, can we jump ahead a little bit? Here you see some of the examples of the giants of African film. Ousmane Sembène from Senegal, the late Ousmane Sembène. There are others, Jibril Job Mambeti, whom I had the pleasure of spending time with in Senegal some years ago, right before he passed away. And underneath is their filmography. Haile Garima from Ethiopia recently has gained critical acclaim with his film Teza. He's gotten a couple of New York Times write-ups. And Safi Faye from Senegal, also a pioneer Ethiopian woman filmmaker. There are many others, Med Hondo from Mauritania, Suleiman Cisse, Kwao Ansa from Ghana, Suleiman Cisse from Mali, Ahmed Rashedi from Algeria, Abdurrahman Sisako, and Salim Mokria Yamane from Ethiopia, Yamane Demise. Since the 1960s, African cinema has grown and transformed to encompass a broad range of contemporary African experience, and it's marked by diverse aesthetic and ideological concerns. There are severe limitations regarding production and exhibition and distribution of African cinema in the continent. But despite this, the filmmakers have maintained a very urgent sort of cultural agenda that continues to be asserted through the works of African filmmakers. Taken as a whole, Mantia Jawara, who's a film scholar, Malian film scholar, writes that certain typologies exist in African cinema, and they reflect the continent in its quest for social and economic justice, for identity, and for history. And these would be the sort of the broad categories under which one can study African film. The spread of film festivals that wholly or partly feature works by African filmmakers is dramatic. And from a list that was compiled in 2004, I counted about 17 festivals in Africa, about 27 in Europe, and about 8 festivals in the US and Canada that fully or partly feature African films. Critics argue that these are not very reliable festivals that happen on the continent. They are maybe 6 or 8 of these are reliable annual and biennial festivals that happen on the continent. The great exception to this, and Gash Baharu skipped this in his presentation, is the success of FESPACO. FESPACO, as many of you know, is the Festival Pan-Africain du Cinéma de Ouagadougou, and it began in 1969 was the first time it happened. It is a festival of film that happens every odd year on the continent. It takes place in Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso. It is one of the most important gatherings of African filmmakers. There are film awards that are awarded. Paul Robeson Prize for Outstanding Film by an African Diaspora filmmaker, Best Cinematography, Best Actress. There's an OAU award. The first prize is the Étalon d'Or de Yenanga, the Golden Stallion of Yenanga, a very coveted award. And it's also a forum where African filmmakers can share their work, can buy film stock, can disseminate their works. It's a distribution center. And a great deal of the African public can get to see their work. And that's not a small thing. At the forefront of this is sort of the recent phenomenon, relatively recent phenomenon of the Nigerian video film production, the Nollywood phenomenon. I don't know how many of you would have seen Nollywood films, but the film industry in Nigeria, known as Nollywood, has, have you? By sheer number of films that it produces per year, it ranks third in the world after Hollywood and Bollywood. And it is, it's geographically located, the industry is geographically located in the Surulere district of Lagos. And it's sort of a concentrated place where the proximity of the directors and the technicians and the participants has led to this explosion of film industry. It's created a competitive advantage that the production is actually occurs in one location. Nollywood was born out of fierce competition among independent film producers, and it really up to an average of 5 movies have been released every day in the Nollywood industry. That's sort of the high end of it. And because the industry has been created out of brand new technology, the people involved are literally learning this as they go. 3 things came together in Nigeria to have this takeoff. The digital revolution worldwide was one phenomenon. The Yoruba traveling theater, the success of the Yoruba traveling theater, and the demand of culture in the form of video films. And I'll skip the part that talks about celluloid film in Nigeria and why that failed, basically because it was too expensive to produce Nigerian film on 36 millimeter and 16 millimeter film. Nigerian cinematography has been invigorated in the beginning by the making of Yoruba film. 5 minutes. Ooh, Mr. Gendarme is very heavy here. Okay. The production of Nollywood films, it starts with the producer taking up a script and going out and finding the director and the technical crew for production. And usually the film shooting takes 10 to 20 days. The film is made in digital format, and the cost of editing takes a couple of weeks, 1 to 2 weeks. So the entire process is completed within a month to 5 weeks. Hollywood and Bollywood format, just to give you some sense of that, the entire process takes several months and up to a year. And journalists who have accompanied Nollywood directors on their travels as they're shooting films describe this very interesting negotiation that takes place. For example, if a film director chooses a place to shoot a film, then the local village, the elders of the local village will have to be consulted, and the community might negotiate, for example, well, will you build us a road as you're filming this part of the film? And the producer would have to build a road in exchange. So there's all kinds of interesting give and take happening on that level. Distribution for Nollywood films happens mostly through very informal channels. There is very little formal international market for Nollywood, although a lot of Nollywood films get sold. The films cost an average of about $15,000 to make. And there are a lot of statistics about what kind of revenue these generate. One number that I saw is 97 million estimate of revenues from film sales. Nollywood has contributed immensely to employment in Nigeria. There are the high-end estimate about 1 million people working for the industry, conservative estimate of about 500,000. But I think one of the most important things about this is that the industry has developed without any intervention from the government and is free from government subsidies, so it's privately funded. The economic contribution of Nollywood industry to overall GDP of the country is about 661.5 million for 2005. And this isn't significant but for the relative size compared to other culture industries, it's very strong. Nollywood's position is very strong. Views on Nollywood are extremely mixed at best. There are many enthusiastic supporters because folks think this is a young industry, it's a growing industry, it is an independent industry, and so should be encouraged in many ways. Nollywood filmmakers would readily agree they've never seen the art films of the other African filmmakers, the art films of their works, and yet Nollywood has a huge following. It is very much popular in the sense that many people relate to the stories that are happening in Nollywood. And so there are pros and cons there, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about that during the discussion. I'm still at 5 minutes. I think the gendarme has forgotten. Okay, let me talk a little bit about music. African music in its diversity, in its dynamism, in its inventiveness one can say very, very many things about it. In West Africa, there's Ghanaian high life music. It has, taken there are different genres of high life music, the most recent being burger high life, which is more disco influenced, and hip life, which is like hip hop and high life mix. In Central Africa, there's a fusion of son and rumba, Cuban son and rumba music that has somehow blended into a sort of a sound out of Zaire, soukous, and later on dombolo music, which is personified by Koffi Olomide. In Cameroon, there's Makossa, Manu Dibango's sound. There is reggae in other areas of the continent, African reggae, Alpha Blondy, Lucky Dube, and so on. There's Chimurenga music that is very, very political and popular in Zimbabwe. Hip-hop is extremely popular in Kenya, in Uganda, in Tanzania, in places like Senegal. It has been very instrumental in political elections. The audience for African music has expanded dramatically, and we now, for people who follow global music trends, the names of Salif Keita, not the soccer player, Omusangare, Youssou N'Dour, Tumani Jabate, and others are sort of household names. In Nigeria, the Afrobeat sound of Fela Anikulapo Kuti is enjoying a revival, I should say, in the US now. Fela, as you know, was a very active, socially, politically active musician in the 1970s and 80s. 0 minutes, okay. His legacy is now being revived in the US. His biography has recently been reprinted. There is a show on Broadway of Fela's life, a fantastic show if any of you go through New York. There's a musical of Fela's life on Broadway. Let me take a couple of minutes to conclude. What does all of this creativity, explosion of creativity, mean for Africa? Does it have any role to play for Africa? I think yes. I think yes because it is an area of extreme vitality. One can probably have only good news when it comes to African creativity. When one talks about African arts, a lot of good news, at least there. There are challenges. There are challenges of production. There are challenges of distribution. There are challenges of having culture being taken seriously by development people, economists, as a possible area of development. And there are very encouraging signs. There is an African Fund for Arts and Culture, an independent fund that has started recently. There are attempts by World Bank to engage in African culture, to support the African music industry in Senegal and other places. I think maybe the next couple of quotes I can just leave up there, the next couple. This is a quote by Abdoulaye Wade from Senegal, just to kind of highlight the importance of where culture and cultural dialogue is fitting into the development agenda for Africa. And the next slide is a quote by Amartya Sen. And I particularly like the last, actually I'd rather read through this and then sit down. The contributions to the richness of human lives made by the creative arts, often available free or at little cost, does not figure much in the gross national product, or for that matter in the Human Development Index. But that is a problem for the GNP and the HDI, not a reason for the neglect of the creative arts. In the enriching of human lives that development aims at, the augmentation of inexpensive but effective sources of joy and fulfillment has a particularly promising role. Music and the creative arts will never, of course, replace the need for food and medicine, but nor would food and medicine replace the need for the creative arts. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you for being a very good citizen. We will now open the floor, and we'll probably take 3 questions at a time and then have the panelists respond. So first, second, and third. First, over there.
Thank you. I have a question for the discussion on African cinema. Especially when you start comparing with the type of film which come to the FESPACO and the Nollywood film. It has been my limited experience that most of the films that are shown in FESPACO are subsidized, and most of the time, either by African government or by European, sometimes the French Development Agency or the British overseas something. Okay, and on the other hand, the Nollywood films are not subsidized, and it seems to be working well. So it seems like there is a market for African film, but not for the type of film that we see at the FESPACO. What's your take on this? And by the way, I'm from Burkina, so I'm a proud supporter of the FESPACO.
Hi, my name is Sadani. I actually have 2 anecdotes and then a question. I was in the Peace Corps in Guinea in 2001 to 2003 in a small village. And I was born in Jamaica. And every year in this really small village, they actually had a celebration of Bob Marley's birthday. Which was amazing because I don't even know the date of Bob Marley's birthday. So anyway, and the other one was, the other day I was with my mom and we went to visit one of her cousins, and her cousin had a box of Nollywood films that she was exchanging with my mom. And I was just amazed at how this Nollywood films among middle-aged Jamaican women have just sort of taken off because all of my aunts are very much fans of Nollywood films. So it's definitely expanding. And so in saying that, my question, I guess, is sort of what are the implications for cultural exchange between the African diaspora and the African continent?
Let's take a third right there, and we'll come back for another round of three.
Okay, thank you. It's two questions, actually, one relating to youth and one relating to cinema. In terms of youth, my question is, and I'm thinking specifically of Sierra Leone and Freetown, what are some incentives to encourage youth to participate in the agricultural industry? And I say that because agriculture makes up about 75% of the economy, and so many of the youth have this negative perception about agriculture, assuming it's just about farming, and don't see the potential for other things. I'm wondering what are some strategies to give them incentive to get involved in agriculture, leave Freetown, and I'm wondering if for example, if they were guaranteed money, income for doing agriculture-related work, whether it be farming or some other type of work related to the industry that would help the economy, help them get skills. I'm looking at that. I'm trying to think about those possibilities. And then in terms of cinema, I'm wondering also about kind of related to the question before, why can't the two industry, I shouldn't say two industries, but Nollywood and now Gollywood and Sierra Leone has Sollywood. I mean, it is growing everywhere. I mean, Caliwood in Cameroon is huge. So I'm wondering, why can't those home videos and the production distribution of that coexist along with the films at Burkina Faso, because the films of Burkina Faso are very different, but doesn't mean they're not valuable. And I think that message that's being sent in those type of films are just as important. I mean, Nollywood is great, or Nollywood type films are great, but there are certain type of films that we need that variety. And so I'm wondering, why can't we have that? Why do we have to go to, I don't know, I'm just wondering why can't those...
Thank you so much. So could you please address some of that?
The issue of African art films by filmmakers, African filmmakers, is a it's an ongoing debate. One of the reasons, well, maybe, I don't know if one can put it this way, but one of the reasons of the success is that these art films have been mostly produced, supported financially by Europe, France, mostly France for West African filmmakers. And the production and distribution is of a certain quality. It is done not on the continent, it is done mostly in Europe. And so that guarantees a certain kind of sound quality and image quality and so on. They're definitely useful, necessary films, but the way it's been problematized is that they haven't reached an audience in Africa. They are not shown in Africa often enough. They are expensive to bring into universities, to bring into institutions of learning. They're very expensive to run, the camera that you need to run it. You cannot show it in any gathering just as a digital video film can be shown. So there are restrictions of that sort. Are both necessary? I think both are necessary, yes. But how does one develop an audience for both? Does the technology permit for that kind of film to be shown at the rate that the Nollywood film has taken off? I don't know. The question on the other side was the audience development. Again, because African films don't get shown as much, the art films do not get shown as much to as many audiences. I think that's part of the reason that there is this challenge. The digital Nollywood productions are very easy to lay your hands on. You can get it anywhere, even in the US and other places online as well. And so there is a ready-made audience for it. Those stories are supposedly some of it is over dramatized. The content is questionable, but it does have an audience. It has a very big audience. And there's one quote that I'd like to read you of a journalist who was tracking sort of the popularity of these films, and he says, they are what's on television in Namibia. They're on sale in the streets in Kenya. In Congo, they're broadcast with the soundtrack turned down while an interpreter tells the story in Lingala, or another language. In New York, Chinese people are buying them. In Holland, Nollywood stars are recognized in the streets by people from Suriname. And in London, they're hailed by Jamaicans. So this is the reach of Nollywood. It's everywhere. You can't avoid it. There was one other question. Implications for cultural exchange and the diaspora. That's sort of what I was trying to get at when I was talking about the Fela Broadway musical, by the way. It's there, and it's been there a long time, the cultural dialogue between diaspora Africans and Africans from the continent. This is a good example. The Fela production is on Broadway because of financing by Jay-Z and Jada Pinkett Smith, who is Will Smith's wife. And so it's very significant that young African-American celebrities are putting up the money to fund what must be the very first show, I think, on an African musician, on a single African musician's life story. And they put the money up for this to be shown in Broadway, a very expensive venue, sort of high-end cultural venue. And so I think those collaborations have happened over many, many years. People like Harry Belafonte, people like Danny Glover have done the work to get it to the point where they are a part of the success stories now. And so the dialogue is there, it's continuing, it's strong, I think.
Mark or Professor Bahru, do you have anything to...
There were two questions. One was about youth in Sierra Leone, incentives to encourage youth to go back from the city and farm. I guess the question, my question that I think many youth might respond from Freetown is, why would I do that? What doesn't make any sense to me? What incentive could there be? I think if you were away for a while, if you were away in the war, regardless of whether you were an ex-combatant or you were captured if you were a boy or a girl, there's a real fear to going back. And there's also a lot of things about the city that people like, young people like. And the problem, I think, that is hard for people to realize is that African cities don't make economic sense, and this has been mentioned, and yet there they are, and they're growing, and that's where people want to go. And I don't think that, I think in a way this is the problem of other people, not the problem of youth, which is not to say that things are wonderful in the cities, but it's very hard to pull people out. And the question that people would have is why? The other question, and this is something that was raised in the mid-1990s by Paul Richards, which was in Sierra Leone and other areas in that sort of larger area of the Mana River, that there's a crisis of youth. And one of the reasons why youth rebelled, according to Richards, I think it was a little bit causal, his explanation, a little too broad. But there is something to this idea of how difficult tradition made it to become an adult in the rural areas. It's very hard for a young person to have access to land. And there are great expectations that they donate free labor to the older generation as part of living in a rural village, and they just won't do it anymore. I mean, one of the things that's happened in Sierra Leone is after the war, there were lots of human rights trainings. Which I don't recall, I think it was a UN-funded thing, and it was really quite extensive. And one of the results of the human rights trainings is when adults tell youth, okay, son, go clear the land, go clear the coffee field. They say, no, it's my human right, I won't go. And even when they ask kids to go to school, nope, it's my human right. I won't go. And things have really changed dramatically. And I think people need to realize, I got this from somebody in the Ministry of Youth, 1 in 4 Sierra Leoneans lives in East Freetown, not Freetown, East Freetown. It's as densely populated as Hong Kong. It's incredible. And I don't understand why people would want to stay there either, but they do, and more and more and more are coming there. I mean, these villages, you know, people say there used to be 1,000 people here before the war, now there's 300. You know, it's, life's changed.
If you're in Mountain Court, and if you're in East Freetown and you're in Mountain Court, and I mean, you know what Mountain Court looks like, or you know what East Freetown looks like. And if the government creates a strategy to say, we'll guarantee you a salary if you go to Kenema or you go to Kono, and this will be your income to support yourself, to build a life for yourself, not based on necessarily traditional institutions of land ownership, but based on, you know, you creating a source of wealth for yourself, would they not go? Because in Freetown, they're not working.
Well, there's a difference between being unemployed and underemployed. And I would also say that the problem is, and I think we found this in the research in Rwanda and Burundi, is, I mean, what you say makes economic sense, but nothing's going to happen until there's a recognition of what the priorities and concerns of these young people are in the cities. And once that happens, then you can start talking about what some of the solutions might be. But that's not happening in a place like Sierra Leone. And this research approach really pointed out how useful that can be. In Rwanda, just as a quick example, there is a great emphasis in expanding access to secondary school. Well, you know, that if you look at the number of people in secondary school, it's doubled. If you look at it in reference to all secondary school age youth, now instead of 5% of secondary school age youth are in secondary school, it's 10%. The difference is marginal. And now the government's tapped. So now what? What's the issue that we found out with research with youth? Most youth wouldn't go to a secondary school if it was free and next door to their house. The reason is not that they don't value secondary school, but a male youth has to build a house first and then get married to be seen as that he's a man. And female youth have to get married. I mean, this is a cultural expectation that's very powerful. And so there's this feeling among Rwandan youth that, you know, why hope for something that will never happen to me? And so that's sort of the difference between what goes on from the government perspective. We're saying, you know, it's good for youth to be in school. They agree. But, you know, a lot of young men told me, I have no choice. And just to point out, government regulations are making it almost impossible for a youth to finish his house, which means that the future for a lot of these youth is a life of, in cultural terms, of failure. And that's one of the reasons why you go to the city and never go back home.
We can take probably one or two more questions and wrap up. So maybe on this side and on that side. So Dovi and and that lady over there.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Dovi Abi, and I'm from West Africa, a number of countries.
Oh.
I'm surprised by some pronouncement I've heard, in particular coming from the World Bank, because I'm still waiting to see a success case in Africa led by the World Bank, where the government were advised appropriately so by the World Bank. And for the most part, we can draw pretty negative conclusions about the involvement of the bank in Africa. So what makes the bank and its advisors and researchers feel more confident today that they have the answers to the challenges in Africa? Okay. Second quick point is about the projections. Yes, I know one thing that the chair mentioned was the diversity in Africa. And it struck me that I've been hearing pronouncements generalizing some experiences to the whole continent, in particular from Sierra Leone and from Rwanda, which happens to be some of the smallest countries on the continent, which also happens to be some of the least functional countries on the continent. How valid are those projections? Thank you.
Okay. Before I ask my question, I just want to make a point about Nollywood. Actually, Nollywood is the third largest movie industry in terms of revenue, but in terms of films produced, it's the second largest, not the first largest. And then my point is this. My name is Adeswa. I'm a Nigerian, and I'm very optimistic about the future of my country. But I'm concerned about the future of the youths. Now, Nigeria is not a war-torn country like you would have in Syria alone. However, 40% of our 130 million people are between the ages of 18 and 30. And then you can do the numbers and know what that is. Every year, over 2 million young people would apply to go to a university in Nigeria. The universities have about 100,000 spaces available. So if we talk about education and educating the youth, the challenge is that there is, one, not even enough spaces for them to get into the schools, and two, not enough jobs for them when they come out. And I wonder, not just for war-torn countries, the challenge for Africa, for me, is the future of African youth and their place in the society. And I really believe that there should be more talk and discussion around what should happen with this group of people in Africa.
Thank you. So we'll let the panelists respond to that, and we'll wrap up the panel. Okay. Professor Bahru, do you have any thoughts?
I'll just reflect on some of the questions, really. Nothing was specifically addressed to me. But the question of Nollywood or home videos is mass videos. I think it is a generic problem. It's an achievement. There's no question about it. It's an achievement, and it has widespread popularity. It's a mass culture that's growing in front of our eyes. I think in Ethiopia also we are going through a similar phase. Maybe it has not approached the dimension of Nollywood, but in the last few years we have really had a mushrooming of these home videos in Amharic, in the local national language. And that's also the attraction, because quite a number of the other films tend to be in English, which is beyond the reach and accessibility of most Ethiopians. So they really have a particular reason to go to these films. But I think the question of quality of art is very important. And the difference between FESPACO and phenomena like Nollywood is really a question of the quality. Artistically, I think I belong to the side of the critics of this, because I mean, quite some of them really are indistinguishable from soap operas and so on. Thanks to DSTV, they are spreading throughout the continent, and it's not only Nigerians but also Ethiopians. There are some Ethiopians who are really hooked to this soap opera. So I think the question of quality is really a worrying phenomenon. While we celebrate the achievement of mass culture and so on, the impact on the theater in Ethiopia in particular, in the Ethiopian case, the Ethiopians are one of the most loyal theater goers. I mean, in fact, it's amazing the number of people who are seen queuing to see plays in the past. But now, these home videos have taken over, and the theater is dying. So there are these negative implications as well.
Does anybody want to address the question of a generalization that is raised by Dovi on the World Bank and experiences? Yeah.
I think that was directed to me.
Okay, all right.
It's a really good question about the World Bank issue, and I'm glad you raised that. I'll just tell you what happened with this one piece of research for Rwanda and Burundi. The impetus came from people inside of the World Bank in Washington who wanted to know more about youth in Central Africa. Was there a chance of a return to violence? And they were very interested in issues of masculinity and to the degree to which young men were being frustrated, and was that connected to a rise in violence, or should we be concerned about that? So what happened to that research? We learned an awful lot. And in Burundi, my colleague Peter Yuvan, who came out with a book, Life After Violence, the World Bank also wrote a report based on his research. There was a presentation, and the report is being used. But I think more illustrative of what happened is this was a report or a research effort that did not come from the Rwanda office or the Burundi office. And the result is that there was a lot of resistance in the Rwanda office on the really startling findings that we were getting out of Rwanda. And as well, the government was very thoughtful in interviews, but when the report came out that was written by the World Bank based on my research, then it'll never see the light of day. So it's, Rwanda doesn't like bad news, and it's mostly bad news. And it isn't the first time that they've done this. And it isn't just them. I think what happened at the World Bank country office is that they were about to come out, they didn't ask for this report, they were about to come out with their country assistance strategy, which I think is their 5-year plan. And it wasn't about youth. So I think there were internal and external reasons. The other thing is the Minister of Youth wasn't RPF. He wasn't from the ruling party. He was brand new. And my impression when I met him, he was a very nice guy. I think when the report came out, they just went, okay, this is your problem. Take this report, and fix it. And so, he was very generous about what to do next. But I just think that it was a situation where institutionally within the World Bank and then with their partner government, it was just a no-go. And frankly, I didn't realize that the findings were going to be as seriously negative as they turned out to be. Yeah, that was the answer to that question.
Okay. Well, I am most grateful to have been given the opportunity to chair this panel. I just wanted to say that this panel and those before reminded me of the optimistic perspectives of one of Africa's thinkers, Joseph Kizerbo. His work has sought to undo the Afro-pessimism and to restore a sense of hope and optimism in the continent. His work has also rightly emphasized that the continent has overcome several hurdles in its long checkered history, challenges that were even greater than those it is currently facing, such as slavery, colonization, and other dreadful diseases. But the continent has always managed to prevail, as captured in the following African proverb: if you jump and land on fire accidentally, you surely have another jump to make. Please join me in thanking these remarkable scholars for renewing our hope that a continent will always make the second jump when necessary. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Before you leave, you do have a second jump to make, Fallu. I think the best way to end a conference always is when people still have questions. And I note it, I hope you'll get to ask whoever you wanted to ask your question to, because just from your hand it looked important. And I hope we'll have the chance to do that. This does not end here. I hope this does not end here. The conference doesn't end here. We will move to the African Studies Center and in a more familiar surrounding. But I hope also the conversation that we've started here doesn't end here. I won't take too much time. I'll just take a couple of minutes. I want to do 3 things. One, which I have purposely not done since morning. It was not a mistake. Some of my colleagues from the Pardee Center asked me if I had forgotten. I did not, which is to tell you about the Pardee Center, and I wanted to wait to the end. I have always thought that the answer to the question, what do we do at the Pardee Center, should be answered by what we do. And I hope that after this day you have a better sense of what we do. What we want to do is to convene. What we want to do is to converse. What we want to do is to raise questions that help us think about things that we haven't. What we want to do is to raise questions that maybe alert you to think about things that you haven't. So if we are to be defined by what we do, I hope you've looked at the publications that were outside. They define what we do. I hope you've met the people here yourself. That is what we do. That is the people we want to hang out with. And I say all of this, particularly to my BU colleagues, students, and faculty. We are really a center that is defined by what our colleagues do. We took up Africa this year because so many of our colleagues do such great work on Africa. So I wanted to reach out to colleagues, both at BU and otherwise, that please consider us open, consider us encouraging, consider us welcoming to ideas about what we should do. But what we do, in a sense, in the shortest sense of the word, is because we have future, we are not in the prediction business. We are not in the business of figuring out what tomorrow is going to look like. We are in the business of trying to think about what we need to do today to make all of our tomorrows better than what the today is. And therefore, the only thing we change from all of the other research that goes on is we try to look at a time frame that is larger than what most people think of. I think the center is motivated by Fred Pardee's understanding that the great problems of our time, many of the great problems of our time, are all long-term. And yet, everyone who has a role in making decisions about them have short-term incentives. Governments think of the next election, which in countries like mine could be 6 months, and maybe in other countries are 4 years. Policymakers think in 5-year plans, 10-year plans. Academic thinks in tenures and promotions and publications. Everyone who has to think about it tends to think short-term about issues that are long-term. And what we want to create here at the Pardee Center is a space where we can think in a longer term about what we are doing today. Baharu was very, very kind to remind us on my second point that nearly certainly we will have good news from Africa coming on the streets of Boston on Monday. We will have good news coming from Africa. We'll be listening to good news from Africa when we move over to the African Studies Center and listen to this wonderful, wonderful African music. But all day today, you've had this picture of this child staring at you. We at the center have had the picture of this child staring at us for 3 weeks. 3 weeks ago is when I first saw it. And haunt is not the word. It's inspired us in some ways. I think it's a beautiful picture. It's a beautiful child. It's a confident child. It is a hopeful child. But it is a child also who's asking us a question. All the pictures that Mark showed have the same quality. It is not important whether you are an optimist or not. If you've stuck around all day, you care about Africa. I don't care whether you think the news from Africa is good or whether the news from Africa is bad. The only thing we care about is whether you are thinking about how to make the news better than whatever it is today. And that is really what the conference has been about. And I wanted to thank all of the speakers, all of our 4 wonderful chairs, all of you for being here. And I just wanted to convey to you what a great sort of pleasure it has been for all of us to have been part of this conversation, which you have made so very important.